Welcome back to the final video in the series where we overanalyze the info we got from Togashi, covering the Nen categorizations and proficiency levels of a number of characters. In this video, we'll be tackling the info provided to us about specialists. Let's get into it. I'm kicking things off with a grand revelation. Specialists are special. Stunning and brave, I know, but I am actually making a point. Quite simply, we don't really know how they function. Since I have a whole video dedicated to that topic, I asked you to check it out if you'd like to know more about my thoughts on the matter. There I go into notions such as why the placement of specialization in the Nen diagram is a bit of a blunder on Togashi's part, if the regular Nen proficiency distribution is even applicable to specialists, and if not, what could be a potential alternative, as well as touching on things like, if Chrollo steals a conjuration-based Hatsu, does it actually manifest via conjuration when he uses it? And if so, would he be less efficient at using abilities based in those categories farther away from his innate category of specialization, were the regular distribution to apply? If it sounds convoluted, that's because it is. Hence why I can't really condense it in a proper intro here. The few times I do discuss something that was examined in that video, I'll point it out so that you can make the choice whether or not to watch it if it interests you. Let's first cover Specialization's poster boy, Chrollo Lucifer. When most people think of Specialization or specialists, they understandably think of Chrollo. Heck, even I pull up this picture of him whenever I reference specialists. For the longest time, Bandit Secret, the Hatsu which allows him to steal and use the abilities of others under certain very specific conditions, was heralded by myself and many others as a prototypically specialist ability. But that is no longer the case. Togashi, and I've said this 2 or 3 times by now, has, for better or worse, very much expanded on the limits of the 5 regular categories. One of those more confounding expansions is that of Shikaku's ability to procure the abilities of others. Shikaku is one of First Prince Benjamin's personal soldiers, and his ability, Concept, King of Games, yes, that is explicitly a Yu-Gi-Oh reference, allows him to capture a person's ability by turning it into a card, and in all likelihood, use it. The issue with that is that Shikaku is a manipulator. While I do always try to rationalize these recent peculiar choices in handling Nen, this is definitely one of the more egregious ones in my personal opinion. How this could be accomplished via manipulation is beyond me. Even if we take into account this recent expansion on the limits of the 5 regular categories, the only ones I can see acquiring another's Hatsu would be either emission or conjuration. As a manipulator, Shikaku would have an 80% proficiency in emission and 60 in conjuration, which is not amazing. Concept is a counteractive type which would give it a boost, but that's still a stretch in my eyes. This was all to make clear that acquiring another's Hatsu seems to no longer be a purely specialist ability type. Moving on to actually talking about Chrollo, as a pure specialist, he was given a proficiency ranking, being rated at Natural, the 3rd highest rank. As mentioned in previous videos, this puts him on the level of powerhouses such as Silva, Uvogin, Illumi, and, of course, Hisoka. When I first started this series, I was actually a bit surprised that he wasn't rated at Extreme, the highest proficiency rank, since realistically, if any Phantom Troop member would be at this tier, it would have to be him. But after going through all the characters, I'm actually glad he's not. Extreme means that someone's reached the very peak of their Nen prowess. As such, there wouldn't be too much room for improvement. This not only makes sense considering Chrollo hasn't even hit 30 yet, and the humans we see in the Extreme tier are almost exclusively 50+, but also means that he is yet to realize his full unbridled potential. For whatever it's worth, I believe Chrollo to be the most powerful human character in his proficiency bracket. Feel free to argue in the comments. Next, let's do a relatively quick one. Neon Nostrade, a pure specialist whose Nen proficiency is ranked at Excellent. She has the ability to see the currently setting course potential future for a particular individual, as long as she has access to some specific information about them. If there's any ability, Mannequin not included, in the series that cannot be anything else but specialization, it's this one. There's no arguing that. Feel free to argue in the comments. Since I think it has been a few videos since I've said this, I just wanted to reiterate here that Nen proficiency rankings are not necessarily indicative of combat prowess. i.e. this does not mean that Neon can take on Knuckle in a street brawl, unless she has one of her goons take a dog hostage or something. What it is indicative of is her mastery of Nen pertaining to her ability. The reason I nonetheless sometimes compare characters on the basis of their proficiencies, such as when I ranted about Knuckle having a greater proficiency rating than Moral, is because this makes sense to do so to a limited degree with combat-capable characters of a certain caliber. And I'm veering off track again. Back on topic. Neon being at excellent is interesting because it means her Hatsu to see the future could still improve. Whether that would entail seeing deeper into the future beyond the first 3 or 4 weeks, additional key details, lesser restrictions, or anything else is anyone's guess. Alright, let's now move on to the best cat girl / boy of the show, Neferpito. Pito is kind of in the opposite boat to Neon. While Neon's ability must necessarily be specialization based, none of Pito's own abilities require specialization, based on what we've seen and can be explained via the 5 regular categories. Dr. Blythe is conjuration or emission, plus Pito's medical know-how, which could further be elevated via transmutation and or enhancement to foster healing and recovery. Bisky's Cookie-chan has an analogous skill set, but with a masseuse gimmick instead of a doctor one, and Bisky is a pure transmuter. Next, her unnamed puppeteering ability can be entirely explained via conjuration / emission paired with manipulation. Finally, Therapist Cora, Pito's ability to manipulate and enhance herself, can be entirely done via, again, conjuration / emission in conjunction with manipulation and enhancement. While she is all over the place with regards to the categories she's implementing, that's not unheard of. Just ask Netero, Razor, Genthru, or Moral. However, the implementation of multiple categories can actually be a soft indication of specialization on its own, if my theory on how it works coincides with how Togashi views the category. You see, I believe specialists to have an entirely unique Nen proficiency distribution. For example, someone like Pito may actually have something like a 100% proficiency in manipulation, 90% in conjuration, and 80% in enhancement, based on how pertinent those categories are to her abilities, while having a mere 40% for emission, considering she can only summon Dr. Blythe in close range and cannot move away more than 20 meters from it after it manifests. This 40% estimation is based on the fact that while she was indeed able to control about 50 puppets at a time at long range, Morel stated that they were of a worse quality than his own smoke soldiers. This despite the vast difference in aura capacity. If you'd like to hear about this in more detail, I do encourage you to check out the Is Specialization Broken video I referenced earlier. With all that said, considering none of her abilities seem to evoke effects which necessitate specialization, it would have made equal sense for her to simply be a manipulator or conjurer. As far as her proficiency ranking is concerned, she is, together with the rest of the Royal Guards, ranked at natural. While it would have made sense, to me, for all of the Royal Guards to be at extreme, along with Meruem, it does make sense that they are one step below the king. I am, however, still a bit surprised that Pito herself wasn't ranked at that highest proficiency rank, due to her going absolutely all out against Gonsan and overcoming her already staggeringly high limits, with her post-mortem Nen empowered form being capable of gravely injuring someone on the durability level of pre-Rose Meruem. Since she's placed on the same skill level as Poof and Yuppie, we can deduce that post-mortem Nen is most likely its own very specific thing, and doesn't actually boost a person's Nen proficiency, but works via sheer emotion and willpower to empower already existing abilities in the short term, without actually improving one's skill level. The second to last pure specialist to have been confirmed and given a rating is Phantom Troop's own Pakunoda. Paku is in a similar boat to her beloved Dancho, wherein her ability to read minds once fell squarely in the domain of specialization, but was recently shown to be a more generic ability type, thanks to Lynch and her Hatsu named Body and Soul. Body and Soul allows Lynch to ask someone a question, punch them, and then make the target answer via his or her inner voice. While a bit more limited and far less subtle, it nonetheless comes down to the same kind of ability type, i.e. mind reading. Since Lynch was confirmed to be an emitter, we can assume that she evokes the punching bag's memory by asking them a question, and then emits it to her own mind by giving them the old 1-2. 3, 4, 5, 6. It was said that Pakunoda's mind-reading ability was really rare, and I had always assumed that to be because of it being a specialization-based ability. While this does retroactively diminish the ability's innate value, it now points us towards another, reasonable reason why it would be considered rare. It could be that Nen users, in general, simply don't opt for this kind of ability type, and that Pakunoda's decision to do so is rare owing to this and not her specialist status. Shizuku was also stated to have a rare and thus valuable ability type, so this does track. As far as her proficiency is concerned, she's actually ranked at Skillful, the lowest proficiency rank. While she's obviously not much of a fighter when compared to the rest of the troop, since these rankings are supposed to communicate a character's proficiency with their Hatsu, for the most part, as a founding member of the Phantom Troop, it is a bit conspicuous. I can see why someone like Shizuku would be at Skillful, considering she not only seems like a relatively newer member to the troop, but appears to be younger than most of the others as well. A potential explanation I've thought of is that Paku had no real reason to work on her Nen too much. I can imagine she wasn't too active while not called upon by Chrollo, and was most likely living a fairly cushy life thanks to her ability to subtly read minds. She could have used it to make absolute bank in numerous ways while undergoing minimal to no risk to herself. Paku was also different when compared to a lot of the other members, who are far more belligerent and see flagrant thievery and everything that comes with it as a part of their core identity. With her ability to read minds and contact being quite good enough for the troop's purposes, and considering she wasn't really expected to be a frontline fighter, with others being more than willing to fill that role, Paku had no real reason to develop her Nen beyond what was necessary. Last, but absolutely not least, let us cover Aluka/Nanika, who've been rated at Extreme, the highest proficiency rank. The thing I find a bit strange is that Togashi listed Aluka as being at Extreme, not Aluka/Nanika or just Nanika. This opens us up to two potential possibilities, one of which I believe to be more likely than the other. First, while Aluka was stated by Killua to be an entirely normal kid without any Nen capability, it's not impossible that she's a genius similar to Komugi. Note that Komugi's ability to evermore increase her mastery of Gungi in part came about due to her status as a pure enhancer, whose proficiency ranking in doing so was rated at natural. This tells us that it's not impossible that either in her own right or as a product of her parasitic or symbiotic codependence with Nanika, Aluka may have developed the Nen-based capacity to act as a host for Nanika. In other words, what may be rated at extreme is Aluka's own capacity to act as a host, through which Nanika is able to channel its powers. The second option, and the one I believe to be more likely, is that after Darius's and Killua's character arcs, at the tail end of the chairman election, Togashi no longer views Aluka and Nanika as entirely separate entities. As such, this extreme rating indeed refers to Nanika's supposedly limitless ability to manifest the desires of others. If so, this confirms that Nanika's ability is Nen-based, which in turn confirms that the abilities and powers of the 5 calamities of the Dark Continent are almost certainly all Nen-based, since there is basically no doubt in my mind that Nanika itself is one of the Ai. This is valuable because it tells us that while they are insanely powerful, the threats of the Dark Continent should still abide by the limitations of Nen to some extent. Though it's clear that while humans may be incapable of creating a sword that can cut or an arrow that can pierce through literally anything, the creatures beyond Lake Mobius do not seem to abide by this inherently human limitation.